Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Britt Whitmore, Executive Director of Marketing and Sponsorships at STAT, a health and medicine media company, if you don't know us. And we have a terrific discussion planned for you guys today around what seems to be the hottest topic. Everybody's talking about it right now, AI. However, as this session title notes, clinical AI is not just any AI. So we're going to get deep into that distinction. I'm here with Karim Galil, co-founder and CEO of Mendel AI, Charles Fisher, founder and CEO of Unlearn AI, and Dr. Larry Lapointe, Senior Director of R&D, Data, and AI Initiatives, Quest Diagnostics, Inc. Over the course of the next hour, like I said, we'll dive into that distinction, along with how scientists are merging different types of AI for better results and where AI is going in medicine. I will also be saving 15 minutes of time for questions at the end, so please don't be shy. There is a microphone in the middle of the room, so please make your way up there when I cue you. So, first, I'll let these impressive speakers speak for themselves. Karim, why don't you start? Give us your 1 to 2 minute elevator pitch when it comes to AI and clinical AI specifically.
What Mendel does as a company. So we are a clinically responsible AI company. Think of us as a co-pilot for bioinformaticians and their dependents. A lot of folks are sitting on top of a lot of clinical data. They write a lot of code to try to answer questions. How many colon cancer patients did we see last year? We help them get those answers faster, easier. Things that takes like a click of a button, but more importantly, more accurate. So we help them get the truth out of the data through an AI system that has a lot of features that makes it a clinically responsible AI system.
Great. Charles, what about you?
So our work at Unlearn is building around what we call digital twins of people. And a digital twin is a computer model of an individual person that allows us to basically forecast what that person's health is going to look like in the future under whatever scenario we might care about. Today, we primarily work with biopharma companies who are running clinical trials. Essentially, what we say is, what's going to happen to a person in this clinical trial if they were to get a placebo? And then by having that information, when a patient starts the trial, allows us to design studies in which fewer patients actually need to get placebos. So if we can run studies where fewer people need to get placebos, that's obviously really helpful for patients who are volunteering for studies, but it also just cuts down the time and cost that we need. We have huge ambitions to move this way beyond clinical trials as the starting point, but we're really like a technological, like R&D focused company. So trying to continue to build this digital twin technology for the future of medicine.
Awesome. And Larry, last but not least.
Yeah, thank you. So unlike my colleagues here, I'm an AI user. So we're not doing a lot of AI research, except as it applies to translational work to create better healthcare outcomes. So at Quest Diagnostics, we excel at collecting your specimens, whether they're blood specimens or something you get from a hospital that's you're removed at a hospital, moving that specimen into a lab and translating that specimen into digital data that then can become information for you and your doctor to make critical healthcare decisions. What we are learning to be good at is how do we use those data, the 70 billion data points that we've collected to really uncover real innovation and make healthcare improvements going forward. So we're pretty excited to be here. And this is, I should say from the outset, as though I'm working for Quest Diagnostics, I've used my own, so I don't get anyone in trouble.
Like I said, this will be a very interesting discussion today. Now let's start by painting the picture of the landscape for us. AI has gone from being a distant promise, kind of sci-fi situation to today's hottest trend. What exactly is clinical AI, and why is it crucial to differentiate that between other AI uses? Karim, why don't you start?
Yeah, so the best way, one of the hardest questions is like, how do you define AI? There's actually a lot of different definitions of AI. And my favorite definition, it's a computer model for something that a brain would do. So think of like our brains are driving a car. A Tesla is essentially a model of how we would do that. There's two schools of thought today around that. One is AGI, or it's this general purpose AI that's going to solve everything under the sun. It's essentially building foundational models that would mimic our brains, and hence it can do everything. It can answer questions, it can drive a car, and it can help in drug development, for example. There is another school around domain specificity, which is you don't start with the AI to solve every problem. You start with a problem and you figure out the right AI stack that solves specifically this problem. I'm an advocate of the second school of thought, because even when you look at the definition of we are trying to model our brains are not general purpose AI. You don't find we're good in certain things, but we're not good in everything. So even when you go down the definition of it's a model of the brain, by default you should go towards more domain specificity. Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to the specific field of medicine, there is also many different definitions. What is a clinical AI? For me, a clinical AI should have 4 attributes. One, it should be an explainable system. It cannot be like a neuron, it cannot be a black box, because essentially in medicine you're trained to question everything that you're being told. So if an AI system renders a judgment, to an AI user like Larry wants to know, why did the AI make that judgment? And it's not something that exists with most of the generic domain AI systems. The second is it has to be guarded against things like hallucinations. Not to say that it cannot be inaccurate, but when it is wrong, it has to be consistently wrong. When it is right, it has to be consistently right. The more 2 important ones are, it has to be able to clinically reason. It has to understand when fatigue is a symptom and when fatigue is a side effect. It has to also understand that a patient that had like a hysterectomy, just removed their uterus, cannot conceive babies later on. You find actually in medical records, the patient went through a hysterectomy and then an AI system saying the patient just had a delivery or something. It cannot happen. And then the third thing is, it has to understand a patient journey rather than a document or a page. So a lot of the AI systems we have today, especially in the NLP space, is really good in reading a document or reading a page, but it starts becoming harder when the context window or the size of the data becomes bigger and bigger. And when you look at an average oncology patient record, it can go between 500 to 1,000 pages. And it has a lot of conflicting facts. So you need a system that is able to read all these pages, but also start reconciling some of the facts that's happening there. Those are 4 problems that I think are like must to have to basically have an application that can be adopted in a field like medicine.
Yeah. Larry, what are your thoughts on this?
So I think Kareem mentioned guide rails. So I think the obvious differentiator for clinical AI is the stakes are higher. It's life or death sometimes. It can be, and so therefore you need guardrails. Just like we already have guardrails for our human care providers, though maybe in some respects, we need to make sure we're thinking about that from when we have digital providers as well. In particular, this focus on, for example, explainability, that's critical. Most human providers can explain and have a rationale for why they made a particular diagnosis or particular finding or therapeutic pathway. The second point is hallucination. I take Kareem's point that it really comes down to having a deterministic solution. Clearly, even humans are wrong, but can they be wrong in somewhat of a consistent manner? So Kareem's point that if it's wrong, at least it's making the same mistakes. That allows us to build further guide rails around such mistakes. So I think that's the big differentiator for me. I think it still comes down to math and engineering, but it's a question of application and the stakes around clinical AI.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of mentioned this, both of you. If we think about AI as inspired by how the brain works, right? There are 2 types of thinking. There's system 1, fast, intuitive, but less in depth, right? And then there's system 2, which is slower, systematic, but better at solving these tough problems. So like you mentioned, Kareem, many machine learning tools focus on this fast, intuitive system, but a criticism is that they can parrot information and not actually understand it, which leads to something like a hallucination. So going back to what you all said, I mean, that's crucial in clinical AI to really, create a better system that merges both of them together. Reasoning is a big topic in the AI space, as is the idea of achieving human-like intelligence. Charles, what do you think of this?
What do I think? What I think of this? So what do you mean?
Yeah, of the aim to achieve human-like intelligence. Is it possible?
Oh yeah, it's super possible. I don't think it'll be that long before we achieve human-like intelligence. 5 to 10 years. I'm much more interested myself. I mean, I think that there's different ways that you can look at that question.
Yeah.
There's a ton of people who are looking at trying to achieve human-like intelligence, and you might just think of an AGI as a type of AI system that can do any problem a human can do as well. And I think that's probably 5 to 10 years away. But I'm actually not that interested in that problem personally. I'm interested in looking at the problems that humanity has found too difficult to solve, that humans don't know how to solve. And how can we create AI systems that are super intelligent, okay, that can solve the things that are just we're too dumb, the humans are too dumb for. And there's actually a really great example of, there are real things, particularly in medicine, where those types of technologies exist for really narrow things. I think AlphaFold from DeepMind is a really great example of this. If you were to write down right now the amino acid sequence of a protein, and you were to say, Charles, what's its 3-dimensional structure? I cannot tell you. Right? And I could take any person on earth and show them that thing, and they probably cannot tell you either, right? So, but we can create algorithms that are able to solve those problems that are actually impossible. It's a great, and even beyond that, right? So I did my PhD in protein folding, and we were working on that for traditional techniques for 50 years, make no progress. And then, applying these new methodologies, we were able to make a huge, giant leap in a really short amount of time. So I think AGI is a really interesting question, and there's a ton of people that are working on that. But I think superintelligence is a more interesting question because there are so many problems within medicine that we just don't know how to solve today.
Right.
And if we had algorithms that we could use to solve those impossible problems, that would make a tremendous difference for our ability to cure diseases that we don't know how to treat today.
So do you see superintelligence and AGI as two different things?
I do, yes.
So in that sense, an AGI will never come to the level of a super intelligent machine in every problem.
Never is a long time. I'm not going to commit to a never. Never is a really, really long time. I think in that 5 to 10 year time scale, people are talking about using, in this near term time scale, people are talking about AGI systems that are automating tasks that people can do relatively easily. I think a lot of the reason for that is because the training data are the data that people are able to interact with easily. AI is really good at pictures because people are good at pictures. AI is really good at language because people are good at language, right? But it turns out that when you get into the areas that people don't understand, our algorithms are worse. And so it's how do we actually figure out to go to those problems? I think eventually AGI will help with it. AGI will help many in the future will solve everything. But I think in the 10 years, it's if you want to have those superhuman abilities, you're developing them for specific tasks.
I foundationally disagree with that.
It's getting interesting.
And the reason that is the case, I think you actually made the point about the idea of superintelligence versus an AGI system. And I agree with you on that, but I don't see that in the next 5 to 10 years we're going to have a super intelligent system that's going to be super intelligent in every problem. I see the problem, for example, that you are solving.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Beyond 5 to 10 years, at some point, I think that will happen.
Yeah.
I think within this 5 to 10 year time scale, super intelligent thing is narrow.
Exactly.
But I think that we will have general intelligence that's at human level, but I think super intelligence will be narrow in the short term.
And I think it's a critical point when you start talking about clinical AI, because a lot of the folks that, like on the user side, like Larry is a generally sophisticated AI user, but you don't find that in everywhere in healthcare. Like there's going to be a nurse using the system, there's going to be someone who's great in PhD in chemistry using the system. They're not essentially all like experts in AI, and the idea of AGI becomes very tempting when we talk only about the problems that systems today can solve. Mm-hmm. But it's like, how do I say this? It's like bias by omission. When we start talking about the problems that actually need super intelligence, you quickly figure out that, yeah, AGI is really not a 10 years type of a journey. It's going to be way more than that. One of the famous folks behind neural networks, Yann LeCun, has this very interesting, he was with Lex Friedman in the podcast, and he was asking him the question about reasoning. Lex was asking Yann LeCun, like, what do you think about AI and reasoning, and is AGI going to be able to reason like humans? He goes, well, today's AI is not even mimicking the brain of a cat. So let's get to a cat, then let's start talking about human level reasoning. And when you start thinking of that, it puts things into context for you. Cat-like functions, like, as he said, like recognition images, certain functions, yeah, the foundational models we have today can get there, but there are very hard problems that I don't think the AGI is going to get to in the next 5 years.
I think the protein folding problem is a bit of a red herring. I think there are lots of cases where machines can outperform humans in all kinds of ways. Same thing with the Rubik's Cube. Down the toll highway, they can process license plates much faster than you and I can. I'm not sure I would qualify that as, I guess it depends on how you define intelligence.
It's a really big difference, right? Because it learns to do it by just seeing
So my
data.
question,
whereas when you think about that toll processing thing, an engineer has gone in and written a rule-based system.
So the issue is, and this does get back to clinical AI, I'm happy to do that. In fact, the superintelligence is really nice. Who here would rather have their physician who has gone through 8 years of training or however many years they do, and provides they can look at the data and say, here's what I think we need to do, and here's the next step, versus the perfect chess player that has all the data and just gets the right answer every time. I think we can all respect that's a good place. That's going to be an interesting place to go and perhaps helpful. It's not the superintelligence I'm interested in. It's where's the super judgment in AI? I think that's the missing piece there, because it's the judgment side of this. Having all the information doesn't necessarily mean you can make a good judgment about whether you should, which path you should provide. That has to be given to the families, and they make the decision based on that. But I think super intelligence is one thing. Super judgment might be a little more interesting.
So, Larry, what are some real-world applications of clinical AI that most excite you right now?
They're a lot more pedestrian than the stuff Charles is talking about. So we
welcome everything. Come on.
Yeah. So, but frankly, they're important, and I think we're starting to make real progress here. So at Quest, I mentioned earlier, we sit on about 70 billion data points. We generate 10 million slides a year with a team of 400 odd pathologists around the country. We're the largest pathology provider in that space. So that's an industry that's hard. It's like radiology. It's been constricting a bit. So how can we use learning algorithms to accelerate and provide co-pilot functionality to our radiologists so they can really focus on the pieces they need to focus on? That has operational benefits, but also has patient benefits. And so I think in that respect, that's a good example of a kind of a problem space we're working on. Another one is, and we might have spoken about this earlier, before this meeting, and that is that Quest generates all kinds of clinical data, from somewhat simplistic cholesterol results, but also we create, we'll measure your human genome and sequence the DNA, in a patient. And we have these pathology data points. So how do we bring all those disparate data sets together in a way that we get the whole picture? That's an area where, I think, the automatic protein folding technology can really help. So those are some of the things that we're looking at today.
That's great. That's exciting. So we've touched on this a little bit, but let's go deeper into symbolic AI versus, deep learning based LLMs like ChatGPT. How does clinical AI, let's get detailed here. How does clinical AI leverage kind of the benefits of both and address the issues of both? So Kareem, do you want to take this one?
So essentially, symbolic AI refers to a system that has some sorts of symbols or relationship between symbols. You understand the relationship between colon as an organ and cancer as a disease and DNA as being the cause of this all thing to have. Like you understand the relationship between things in some sort of a graph or a knowledge representation. And the idea here is like you focus on reasoning and let's forget about learning. Versus deep learning is more about you look at a lot of data, the machine sees the patterns and uses very advanced statistics to kind of learn from the data. And then let's worry about reasoning later on. So every system has its own pros and cons, right? In a symbolic system, you need experts to kind of code those rules or code this logic. In deep learning, you essentially can rely on a lot of data and bypass the expert in many different ways. So there's pros and cons for every approach, but in late 80s, early 90s, symbolic AI was one of the reasons why AI didn't really work. And hence the whole idea of the AI winter happened. And if you look today at Google Scholar and you search for deep learning, you can find, I think in the last 4 years, 1.2 papers published about deep learning. If you put symbolic AI, you'll find around 18,000 papers. That's the distance between those two domains. Now, with the very big advancements that's happening in deep learning, there is a lot of talk about coupling both systems together, thinking of like putting some sort of guardrails, like logic guardrails, on top of a deep learning model, so you get the best of both worlds. Essentially, you get a machine that can learn from a lot of data and see patterns that humans didn't even think of when they were putting down the logic. But you also get some sort of logic. Again, back to the idea of if a patient had hysterectomy, she's not going to be probably conceiving babies later on. That kind of logic you would add on top of the neural network or the deep learning. I'm personally fond of, excited about that approach. We at Mendel has been taking this approach from day one. There is in that approach, like one of the key things that we have done is we've hired a lot of physicians and we trained them to think like AI scientists, but we've also hired a lot of AI scientists and trained them to think like those physicians. And between those two, you start building systems that are pretty interesting. Again, that's because the problem that I'm going after requires very advanced reasoning capabilities. Hence, a coupling approach makes a lot of sense. I think some other problems like what Charles is, for example, going after doesn't necessarily, my point is, as we are talking about, and I understand that the audience is not all technical experts, but when we talk about symbolic AI, deep learning, any type of approach, imagine if you go to Home Depot and you're only permitted to buy one tool to build the building. I don't think you can build the building, right? And essentially when we say, should we use this or we use that, we're essentially talking about one tool to solve all the problems. I'm excited more about going to Home Depot and picking a bunch of tools, and according to the problem, you pick the right combination of tools to fix that problem. So I don't think there is a good, bad answer. Symbolic is better than deep learning or deep learning is better than symbolic. It's more about what does the problem need and what's the best approach. Would you agree? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it depends on the timescales you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a famous thing that people talk about in AI research, that Richard Sutton, he's a really famous AI researcher, and he has something called the bitter lesson. And the bitter lesson is that human beings, for years and years and years, we would, this is the way it all used to be done, is we would put in our knowledge into the AI algorithm itself. So we would hard code our knowledge. And what people have seen over and over again is that gives you a short-term boost. So in the near term, that makes your algorithm better than if you didn't do that. Mm-hmm. But in the long term, all of those methods have lost to things that just use a bigger computer and more data. And so I think it depends a lot on what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. I think that it's a challenge. I mean, because for example, I wear in my daily life 2 very different hats, right? I'm a CEO. And so I run a company and we need to deliver value to our customers today. But by training, I'm a theoretical physicist and AI researcher. And so when you hear me talking about these questions about how do we build superintelligence, and I'm not saying we know how to do those things today, but I'm very comfortable with the fact that we don't, mm-hmm. because My job as an AI researcher is to find these solutions that allow us to do it. That's my mission in life, is to build that. And I believe deep learning gets us there. I believe deep learning gets us there without symbolic AI. However, there's a today problem that we need to solve, also problems that can work today, and there are breakthroughs that are going to be required to allow deep neural networks to do that. And so if you want to solve those today problems, then you need to create, I would almost call them AI systems. Like, it's usually not one model, right? When you interact with ChatGPT, you're not interacting directly with the model. There's a whole bunch of other stuff there that is making it work for you in that moment, and that's what we need, that stuff today. And our goal as researchers is to come up with breakthroughs so that in the future, we won't need that stuff.
Right.
But there are breakthroughs that are going to be required to get there, I think.
Larry, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with everything Kareem and Charles have said. I don't think they're mutually exclusive at all. For the reasons Charles said, the here and now, we want to be able to take a pathology record and determine and figure out, okay, did the pathology, so humans can read that just fine, but if we want to do that at scale, we want to read millions of those quickly, then you really have to, then we're going to apply the AI that we have today on those and determine, okay, where was malignancy diagnosed, where wasn't it? And the symbolic AI component of today's systems really keeps that NLP in check. Furthermore, there's another level of this because medicine is not static; it's changing. Not only our knowledge about it, but the rules, the guidelines. There are many dynamic areas of medicine as well. So it's not just enough to have a really great NLP model and a symbolic AI to sit over the top of it, which is, I think, is a good start. Actually, need to have humans in the loop today. Now, in the fullness of time, will the superintelligence perform those functions? Perhaps, but today, we need to be involved in that. So we have the three pieces. It's the NLP that's excellent and using the latest technologies. It's the symbolic AI to control something I've heard Kareem say many times. And just because it says that it thinks there's a headache in the knee, we don't have one of those. And so symbolic AI helps prevent that. But then you've got the human in the loop to say, you know what, we just found this new syndrome in the knee. Looks like a headache. I mean, I'm being facetious, of course. But you need to have the human in the loop for all three of those pieces to work.
Yeah.
For my work, to try to provide better healthcare services, that's an important. These are all important elements.
Even if you look at my previous example of AlphaFold, AlphaFold is a deep learning system plus search, actually. And that search is like just a human-coded ability to search through what's created. Monte Carlo tree search, it's called. And so it is sort of like a hybrid algorithm that was created to solve that problem. It's not like a learned search or something like that. It is a hard-coded search, and like that is definitely, in terms of the today world, those are the things that people are mostly using.
So one of the biggest limitations of this idea of human-coded logic is we as humans cannot fathom every rule that happens in our brain. So there's always, like, no matter how much of logic you put in a system, you will probably miss something. Or to Larry's point, something changes. For example, there are very famous genes that we thought have no role in cancer, and we were taught in med school that they had no role in cancer, and now we know that they're actually drivers of certain types of cancer, and there's a bunch of drugs built around them. So had someone coded logic in the past that PD-L1, for example, is irrelevant, this rule essentially would fall apart in today's age, and that has been always the argument against coded or logic. The problem, though, is symbolic AI, rule-based systems is a type of symbolic AI, but it's not the only type of symbolic AI. And if you think about like chemistry, all compounds that we see in the universe are essentially driven from the same periodic table. It stood the test of time. The periodic table abstracted chemistry, essentially, right? Can you start getting some inspiration from that, where you can think of medicine as like a lot of different combinations, that come in from the same abstracted logic that you coded in something like a periodic table. So there are very innovative approaches today on how you can use symbolic AI in a way that is not rule-based, that is not crippled by the fact that you have to know every single logic under the sun, but you can start abstracting things and essentially have some sort of a periodic table for knowledge in medicine. Is one of those areas of research that we're talking about. I think that other point that Charles mentioned that a lot of people are not aware of, when you're interacting with ChatGPT, you're not interacting with a model, you're interacting with a recipe of models that come together to give you an answer, which is essentially what we're talking about here. We're talking about a combination of different solutions. One of the biggest proponents of AGI is obviously Google. Google wants always to build an AI that can solve a lot of different problems. But lately we saw, and I assume you guys at Quest should be aware of that, they launched Mendel, which is essentially an LLM only for medicine. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing now even folks who have looked at the problem as one solution will solve everything is now coming more to more domain specificity and different combinations of tools for a specific problem.
Great. So where do you all see clinical AI making the biggest difference right now in medicine and healthcare? Kareem, do you want to start?
I think like problems like what Charles is working on is going to change drug development as we know it. Yeah. I mean, if they solve all the problems that needs to happen, which I know they're working on that, but that's a problem that I'm personally very excited about. But if you talk about AI today, a lot of the things that have high adoption is things that accelerate repetitive work. So think of when the doctor sits with a patient, they have to listen to whatever is happening and type it into the EMR. There's a lot of companies today that would transcribe the conversation and input it directly into the EMR, so saves the doctor a lot of time and effort. This is not a system that requires super intelligence, but it has a lot of big immediate impact on the patient-physician interaction. And we're seeing a lot of companies being built around that space. Things that has to do with coding, like a nurse has to build the insurance company for 10 things the patient went through. Again, operational excellence is an area where we're seeing a lot of adoption, immediate adoption, essentially because it does not require super intelligence. I think the other area is in the 90s, we had a problem in healthcare. We didn't have data, right? The data was all in paper. There was no medical records. People weren't keeping data in databases. Today, we have a bigger problem. We have a lot of data. Like every single minute, there is a lot of data being generated in healthcare. How can we make sense out of this data? Like problems like, for example, you have genomic data, patient records, different visits the patient had. Can you synthesize a patient journey and start asking questions? And this is what Mendel, for example, is working on, and we're seeing very strong adoption because there is a pain point. The pain point is I'm sitting on petabytes of data, but I want to ask a very simple question. How many colon cancer patients responded positively to drug X? And answering that question today require teams, time, and the answer is not usually accurate. And AI systems are really good today. They have the super intelligence today to actually look at this data, different modalities of data, and kind of come with a conclusion that can push the needle today.
And what about you, Charles? Where do you think AI is making the biggest difference right now?
Well, I think that there are two, and kind of piggyback off of what Kareem said, there's kind of like these two different problems, I guess, in the sense of that a lot of I would call them machine learning systems and other things that are available are kind of in the efficiency space that are gaining adoption. I think that there's a second question, which is, well, what's gaining adoption that's really going to make a difference in patient care? Because these are very different things, from like making the hospital have more money and be more efficient and have lower costs and have more time, and like we're delivering better care to patients. I mean, because like my background was, I was in pharma and trying to things like that, so I'm kind of really focused on the sciencey part, and we don't do any of the work around the efficiency. Within that sciencey area, I think that there's a ton of really interesting work going on in AI, all the way from drug discovery, trying to understand the underlying biology and find new targets, to trying to do chemistry better. Can we create new types of drugs that will have lower side effects, or like there's a ton of work on that. And then for the work that we do, and how can we help to, once those drugs are discovered into the clinic, how can we get them to patients as quickly as possible? So I think there's a ton of AI work that's all in that space. I expect that within the next 10 to 20 years, that there will be a dramatic transformation to the way drugs are discovered and developed. And hopefully we go from a 90% failure rate, which is the current, like 90% of drugs that we put into inhuman clinical trials
Isn't
don't
that
work.
wild?
Don't work.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing, honestly.
Yeah,
like I feel like the industry should be embarrassed by that number. It's like, hopefully we can move that needle and actually start to create new medicines that really make a difference for people. I'd say it's interesting because you heard I said 5 to 10 years to AGI and 10 to 20 years for that, right? I actually don't think the barrier is technological. I think the primary barrier is going to be human adoption and more than
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
I actually think if we today have an AI system that is proven to discover I think, sorry to interrupt, but like on that point, like there's a very famous story, like if you have two big objects of like very big, like a very big, heavyweight object and a lightweight object, and you throw them in a vacuum, they should hit ground on the same time because G-force is equal. But people didn't know that in the past, and Galileo was one of the first to actually find this out, and people didn't believe him. They're just like, no, if I have a tennis ball, it's going to hit the ground faster than a very big steel ball. So I think the story is like he went and stood on the fence of the university and conducted an experiment to show everyone that actually it's not true and his theory is correct. Yet they kept teaching that a tennis ball would hit the ground faster. And I think we're seeing that in AI today. If he today can show an AI system that can replace clinical trials, and the FDA actually gave him a regulatory approval to it, I doubt pharma companies are going to start adopting it in the next 1 or 2 years because healthcare is always lagging on the adoption side, not on the technical side, actually.
I know, it's an interesting juxtaposition. You have healthcare and the way that healthcare moves, right? And then you have these startups and AI and how quickly those move and trying to merge them together. I agree with you, Charles, I think, and Kareem. I think that, the adoption itself will be the biggest barrier. So Kareem, I'm interested, hearing your perspective because you're a trained physician. So how does that, Charles was mentioning how he's been in pharma. How does your background in that way inform what you do now? Is it helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the biggest incubators in the world is Y Combinator. They graduated companies like Airbnb and like many very, very big startups. And when you go to the Y Combinator, they have this very famous thing called build something that people want. That's the easiest rule to build a company that is profitable, right? And I don't think you would know what people want unless you have been in the domain. Like you don't know what a physician wants unless you were a physician. You saw a patient, you actually sat in front of a patient, you were like embarrassed that you don't know what treatment that you should prescribe to that patient. You had that emotional experience, I think, is what inspires you. You have to have worked in pharma to understand, like, man, out of every 10 things we have, only one is gonna work out. So coming in from the domain gives you like the empathy to the problem and a better understanding of the problem. And again, back to the idea of AGI versus domain-specific AI. The problem with the AGI type of companies is they don't have that empathy to a specific problem. They have more of like, I'm going to build something that's going to solve everything. And I find there is certain energy and power when you were suffering from something and now you're building a company or building a technology that's going to help you. You would have been a user of that product yourself had that product existed before. I think the other, that being said, also being a physician means I was super naive to what AI can and what AI cannot do. And I think there has been a journey for me to like, I wouldn't say to become an AI expert, but to understand enough about the fundamentals of AI and what it can and what it cannot do so that you're able to merge those two fields together. And I think we're going to see a lot of I'm going to see a lot of like Wall Street people quitting Wall Street and building AI companies that can better do stock trading. And we're going to see a lot of domain experts quitting their domains, learning more about AI and kind of building very interesting companies in the intersection of those two things.
Great. Now, I have a few more questions of my own, but I'd like to open it up to audience questions at this time too. So don't be shy. Please make your way to the microphone if you have a question, and we'll call on you. But in the meantime, okay. We have a lot of companies, they're sitting on top of a ton of clinical data, and they want to make it actionable. They have no idea where to start. They don't know how to interpret or navigate this really overwhelming AI landscape. What's your advice for them? What are the considerations here?
I'll leave this for Larry. He's a great AI buyer, so.
Yeah, I've had that problem before. Look, I think that we've talked about this in a few different ways. The first step is obviously to have structure and understanding your data. So that's a lot harder than it sounds. We're building systems that in some cases are decades old, building on top of systems in some cases are decades old. So making those AI ready is a conversation I have a lot. So are our data AI ready? And so that carries a certain set of things you have to do. But it's classic data wrangling, which I'm sure many of the audience are familiar with. I think that's the first point. The second piece of advice I'd have is, and this goes a little bit to the conversation we were having earlier about human adoption, and how in some ways the startups are outpacing what's currently being used in a really strong way. And so the solution there is be really clear about your questions, and in our case, finding use cases. Everything starts with use cases. That's where I spend most of my time focusing on. What's the use case for this application, so that we can actually make a difference that will be adopted because it provides a benefit. And so, again, we talked earlier about these idea of co-pilots, for example. And I suspect that's going to have traction. Whether you're a physician with a patient in front of you, having a co-pilot AI assistant that is helping you remember what you just need to remember, or in fact giving you hints, that allows you to that allows you to do your job better. That's true whether you're a bioinformatician or whether you are a pathologist at Quest. So I think that's one of the areas that in terms of use cases we're going to be going to. But in terms of starting out, it's really making sure your data are structured and AI ready, and understanding how they're going to fit into the models.
What about the ethics behind all of this? What do you have to consider there? Kareem?
This guy had to go through regulatory stuff. So you want to start?
Yeah, do you want to talk about regulations?
Well, regulation and ethics I think of as being very different things. From an ethical standpoint, the work that we do, again, we're trying to say you can run a clinical trial, fewer people need to get a placebo, you're going to still generate scientifically rigorous results. This seems like a no-brainer, honestly, from an ethical standpoint. There are questions around, I think, that are important for all of the AI companies around data and consent and things like that.
Yeah.
In our case, all of our data that we use, that we're training on, it's all research collected data where patients haven't consented to have their research, to have their data used for these purposes. Like, we're not training off of just like EHR data that you can just purchase. So it's all research consented data. But the regulation question is really around, does it work? That's not like you have to actually demonstrate that what you want to do works. And I think that's the biggest thing, is like, does it really work for the intended task, by the way, which I think is also really important. And the broad regulatory conversation has been really interesting to watch, because you have this broad regulatory conversation that like Congress and like the president.
Oh yeah, it's in the news all the time.
And they're talking about like they're worried about the Terminator, and they're worried about all kinds of stuff. And they're worried about, weirdly, the underlying algorithms. They're talking about like the algorithms and the things like that. I think that's dumb.
Does this say that they don't really understand it?
They definitely don't. But it's really dumb to regulate the underlying algorithm, because people like me exist. Okay, and I will just invent a new one. That's what I do. Every day I invent new kinds of algorithms that are not what people have thought of before. So you outlaw that.
That's your elevator pitch right there.
That's what I do, right? And luckily, actually, it turns out I think the medical regulators are much smarter about this than a lot of the broader regulators because they're actually used to regulating things. They don't understand how it works. Yeah. They don't really understand how drugs work in a lot of ways. We don't understand human biology, but we can test to see if they work. And so they're much more used to saying, like, for this application, did it work or not? And so that's how things look like they're going to be regulated in terms of the application level, at least in medicine. I think that's a really good, really good idea.
I know we have a few folks with.
Yes,
I would say, you know, in terms of looking at what companies need to do to start out, you know, you really bring up a really good point. AI governance has got to be part of the first conversation. So, I mean, that's really critical. It begins and ends with, you know, having really strong, responsible, you know, articulated views of how you're going to use that in AI. That's crucial. I think that's got to be table stakes.
I want to add one thing to that before we take question, but I think where regulation and ethics will meet is if we go beyond the question of does it work, which is essential, but also does it hurt? So, you know, when you look at any clinical trial, you're looking at like efficacy, but you're also looking at like, is there any crazy side effects? And I think Biden asked the Congress to pass a law against robocalls that use AI because someone used his voice to like call, like he was a victim of that. So does the algorithm work? Absolutely it does work. Does it hurt? Yes, it does hurt. And now we're finding the regulators figuring this out and trying to figure ways around it. So I would encourage the regulators as they come into healthcare to not only look at the problem, does it work, but also does it hurt? Does it have any effects that can be life and death or has to breach the patient privacy and
similarly, again, it's not the algorithm. The use, right? You can take an algorithm that is amazing for like reading brain images or something and doing diagnosis, and then like literally hook it up to a surgery robot and have it try to come in and it will kill that person, right? so it's like the use case is very, very
you
important.
know, like in drugs, like there's the off-label use. So you're gonna have to govern the off-label use of some of those models.
All right, I see we have a lot of questions here. Please.
Great. I really appreciate the conversation, a lot of interesting points you've made. I particularly appreciated you saying that a solution is going to come from understanding the pain that a doctor has, that pharma has. I'm here as a patient, as a neurology patient and as a patient advocate working with some folks in that space doing clinical trials and things. And for patients, it's all moving too slowly, right? And whether it's connecting data between clinical trials or connecting data between leading organizations and medical institutions, silos just seem to be such a huge problem to even get all the data in one place so you could run an LLM against it. But what can we as an industry, what can any of us do to help accelerate this by breaking down some of those silos?
Who wants to take this one?
Wow, tough question. I appreciate the frustration. I think that's easy to see, and I would share your view that some of these things seem to take too long. I think they go too slow, right up until they go too fast, and it's really hard to draw that line in some cases. And in healthcare, as we've been saying, you know, there's good reason. It takes a long time to get a drug, even one that's really great, through all the process. For good, bad, or you're ugly, that's the reality. And those systems have evolved for lots of reasons. Now, is that, if you were designing all that with a white sheet of paper, would you put a 10-year time frame on that? Perhaps not. But I think that's where the reality we are, is that, you know, this idea is, does it work, but does it hurt? These are really key discussions, and oftentimes they're not immediately clear. So I think that there are guardrails. I share your frustration, but I think that going too fast could be equally challenging.
I think also like, and this is a little bit controversial, but like always go after the money. And unfortunately, the healthcare system in the US is governed by, I would say, a handful of individuals making the shots in many different ways. You have one big EMR company that I think has most of the coverage of the data that exists in the US, and they're not a public company. They are like garden walls, like they do not talk to many other systems, and when they do, they talk with a fraction of the data, not all the data. So I think the solution for this problem is going to have to do with like what Obama did. If you're not using medical records, I'm going to penalize you. If you're using medical records, I'm going to pay you more. Someone is going to have to step in and start saying, we need this data to talk together, and if not, you're going to be financially penalized. And when it does, you're actually going to be financially incentivized to do that. Unfortunately, if that's not going to happen, I don't see a very near future. To his point, we may have the technology to do it, but we may not have the adoption to get it done, actually.
Yeah, there are tons of reasons things move too slowly. Data siloing is just one of them. I mean, even if you break that down, it's still getting the tools adopted. There's giant bureaucracies everywhere. Everything is super slow moving. I wish I knew how to fix it. That's why I dress like this every day. I wear camouflage. I have a whole closet filled with camouflage because I consider myself at war with the status quo of medical research. I think that the way the current system is moving too slow. I think it's hurting patients. So I don't know how to fix it. I don't. If anyone has any ideas on how to fix the medical system and medical research and get it moving faster, my email is charles@unlearn.ai. Reach out to me. I would love to hear your ideas and see if we can speed up medical research.
Great. Thank you very much.
That was a great opening question. For me, I'm Andrew Stratton. I work with Chan Zuckerberg Initiative in Science and Society, and I lead 60 different grantee organizations that are patient-driven, that are driving research in their areas. And I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of hope and excitement about what clinical trial, AI in clinical trials, specifically for rare disease, where the numbers are really low, will be really beneficial. But Kareem, you said something that sparked my interest. I completely agree that if you are from a domain and you have a different level of expertise and understanding of what the clinicians need, for example, for you. And my question to all of you is, especially in rare disease, we do believe that patients are true experts in the disease area. So I wonder if you all have engaged with patients in addition to clinicians as you're creating these systems. And if you haven't, I strongly encourage you to do so, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
So
silence covers them.
look, I can just speak for myself. At Quest, as it appears to me, we're a very patient-centric group. I mean, that's very, very important in every conversation. So engaging, and we do a lot of work with rare diseases and provide diagnostic solutions in that space. So I appreciate where you're coming from, and and I think we do engage because that's an area we're already in pretty deeply.
So we've done some work in what I would call medium rare diseases. So not like ultra rare indications, but things like ALS, FTD.
Right.
And work directly with the patient advocacy groups in a lot of cases because for us, I mean, especially if you're a machine learning company, you need data. I mean, and it is those patient advocacy groups who have the data, and they also have like I said, we're going to use the actual knowledge. They have the knowledge about what's in those data that's going to be important, which for today's AI systems we need. For all of those things, we're working with those patient advocacy groups.
Brilliant. I encourage it. And Kareem, I'll email you. Okay. Give you more suggestions.
Great. Next.
All right, thank you. So I ran a software startup in the medical software space for several years, from startup to being sold. And I saw the problem, Kareem, you described with being connected to the EMR, particularly with Epic, which I'm sure is the company you were referring to.
I didn't say Epic, though. But I was told coming here, don't mention any company. But
I think there are some problems that can be solved even if you don't have that interoperability. In diagnostics is one that I expected to be solved many years ago. In fact, IBM had Watson, and several years ago here at South by Southwest, they said they could, diagnose better than a doctor. Yet we didn't see any of that. I don't see them here. I don't see any progress. Why do you think that happened, and why? What makes us think that history is not going to repeat itself again?
Who's going to throw maximum shade on Watson?
I think to his point, data interoperability is one of the friction points, but it's not the only friction point. I think the bigger friction point is if you are a vendor, like you're a Mendel or Unlearn, you are selling into a diagnostic company, say into Quest or someone. At the end of the day, there is someone that has to assess your solution and give it the stamp that the company is going to be able to use it. And there is this saying, everyone knows it, in enterprise selling, nobody gets fired for buying IBM. Doesn't essentially mean that IBM is the best in every problem, it's just have a good brand. A lot of the innovation is happening from the non-IBMs. It's like smaller startups, folks who are putting camouflage or leather jackets. But essentially, it's just those people are the ones who are doing the change, but they don't come in with a lot of brand recognition. That's a problem. But then also, we are seeing, and Larry is an exception to that, so I don't mean Larry, but we're seeing a lot of the buyers being folks with an MBA and have taken a couple of courses about AI on Coursera. And now they are AI experts in their organizations. They're actually leading AI teams into their organization. And usually when you come in, it's like everything becomes easy if you don't know. So if you don't understand the complexity of the problem, for them, like all models are born equal in some fashion, and it becomes a very hard job to explain. Like, why is your technology is better than others? And then you always have, we're having a call with actually a diagnostic company, and we were presenting our solution, and the guy said, like, that makes tons of sense, but here's one problem. Do you want to tell me that you figured something that Google did not figure out? That's his problem. Like, how can I convince someone, like, how can I answer a question like that? My answer was like, well, Google figured out something that Yahoo didn't figure out back in the 90s. And it's always David versus Goliath. But I think in today's age, we're having a problem where the people picking between David and Goliath are trending more towards the Goliaths of the world.
Great.
What about the Watson question? Somebody wanted, I saw Charles wanted to answer that.
You know what? Stat did an expose on IBM Watson, so look it up, statnews.com.
All right, thank you.
All right, next up.
Hi, thank you so much.
This will be our last question, by the way, from the audience.
Sure, I'll make it quick. I really appreciate the commentary on patient privacy. I am a little bit curious about, I don't know a ton about HIPAA and the sort of concerns and problems with the health system that are stopping innovation. I'm curious, are there specific points that we would be looking to change in the next couple of years? Is this a whole systemic issue, or kind of where does the issue lie? If that's not too general of a question.
Does anyone want to jump in?
I can take a stab on that. I do appreciate a lot the value of patient privacy in general. But look, today when you sign up to Google, you are essentially selling your life to Google. I think the bigger question is, if we ask patients, are you willing to share more data for things that actually can save your life versus share more data for a company to sell more ads? Which one would you basically pick? I think a lot of the patients would pick the latter. We actually, I think part of the audience today, we have one of the, I would say, very fast-forward organizations is ASCO. It's the American Society of Oncologists, and I think their president is sitting with us today. They were one of the very forward-thinking organizations in understanding the value of combining data to uncover drug development. But they acted as an intermediary between the patient data and between companies willing to leverage this data. And when you have an organization that comes in with a lot of credibility and a lot of unbiased and caring about the patient, I think the patients become more comfortable. So they ran this experiment where a lot of clinicians were willing to share more data if they find a nonprofit with a lot of credibility as an intermediary versus a for-profit business that may misuse this data for business purposes. So I think it's going to be group work between businesses, but between also a lot of patient advocacy groups and a lot of nonprofit organizations that can act as an escrow of the data or an intermediary between the data and the AI companies. But we do need the data to build AI technologies, to his point.
So this is not how it works today at all. And I don't know how to get from where we are today to where I think it should be. But I think patients should own their own health data. And then they can decide what to do with it, what they want, and maybe they should get paid for when it's used. So I don't know what the pathway from here to there is. But like right now, you can go meet with like a medical records company, and they'll be like, "We have data on 300 million Americans. Do you want to buy it?"
100%. Yeah, 100%.
And it's like, well, so now you have. I didn't consent to any of that, and you can absolutely do that. You can go buy that data right now. So there is a big gap, I think, between where we are and where we should be. I don't know what that bridge is.
But if you actually de-identify the data, the law allows you to actually start selling the data. So that's my point. My point is it really about de-identification? Is that the patient privacy? But to his point, there's at least 10 companies that have on their website coverage of more than 300 million patients in the US, which is essentially most of the country. And these companies are $200 million in revenue and plus, and patients are $200 million and plus in debt. So there's a big gap between those.
Well,
thank you very much.
That is the amount of time that we have today. Thank you for joining us. Kareem, Charles, Larry, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for sharing your expertise. Everyone else, enjoy South by.